Hi, I'm Christina from Big Beautiful Sky. Welcome. Today, I want to talk to you about what it's like to be a psychic medium. I was born a psychic medium. Psychic mediumship runs in my family. My great aunt worked as a psychic for a hotline, but runs down my maternal side. Now, being a psychic is not always easy. We know a lot of things. And because we know a lot of things and we know the truth, people get very triggered, especially when you're predicting things 20 to 25 years before they actually happen. Right now, I am watching a prediction that I made unravel from 25 years ago. So I'm going to talk to you about what happened, what I predicted, and it's political. So if you get triggered by politics, change the channel. So 18 years ago, Bush had won his second term. We're in the same nodal cycle that we were in then, right now in 2026. So the North Node is in Pisces, South Node is in Virgo. And we were building up to the great financial crisis. And I could see this. I remember I was working for a national law firm, big, huge law firm, had huge corporate clients. It was not great. And for me, because I could see the evil that was going on and it was scaring me. I could see the evil that was going on within the company I worked for. I could see the evil that was going on within the greater society. And I could see this impending doom racing towards us. I was even in a meeting with our 401k advisor, and he was telling us to invest all our money into our 401k. And I said to him, "What happens if the stock market crashes?" Because I could see it happening. I could feel it. And he said, that won't happen. And I said, "Well, it happened in 1929." He said, "Well, it's not going to happen." It did. It happened. But again, no one was listening. So at that time in 2007, people still believed that 9/11 wasn't an inside job. There had been hundreds of thousands of people who died when the US invaded Iraq. And so I made a decision in that moment. I realized that I was not going to be able to change anything. Since 2000, I'd been telling people what was going on and no one was listening. And so I said, "That's it. I'm leaving." And I left and I moved to Australia. And I watched from Australia as the US economy imploded in 2008. And in Australia, it didn't really affect us that much. The global financial crisis did have an impact, but it was very minimal because Australia is a resources based economy and the Chinese economy was dependent on our iron ore. So I cruised through the GFC and was living up in Australia. I'm so grateful I did that. And now I'm sitting in Australia watching everything happen again and wondering if anyone has learned anything. And I know that we have. I know that consciousness has evolved because of what's coming out. But we're in the same nodal cycle. And so it feels the same. Now, in 2006, before I left the US, I started writing a novel about fascism, the rise of technology, the disruption of society through economic shocks, and finally about the total destruction of the middle class. I could see all of this happening. And what I was doing is I was running down the timeline we were on to see where it would lead. I didn't like what I saw and I didn't know how to communicate it. I didn't have words to communicate what I was seeing. So I wrote a novel. I built characters. I built a storyline. And I told everyone, "Hey, guys, this is where we're going." And it took me a while to publish it because I moved to Australia, I got married, had kids. I didn't publish it until 2016, but it was still ahead of its time. Now, the thing about the novel is that it really was about Nazism. I was seeing these Nazi themes bubbling up, specifically in the Bush administration, but also working in a corporation. The way that you're supposed to just pledge allegiance to the brand was disturbing. I didn't think just completely giving up your individuality once you joined a business made sense. I could not do that. I could not conform. So I named my main character Anna Arendt after the Jewish American philosopher who escaped Nazi Germany and wrote about the banality of evil. She was present during the Adolf Eichmann trial in the 1960s. She observed that Eichmann, a key organizer of the Holocaust, was not a monster per se, but just a thoughtless bureaucrat. She argued that this was more terrifying than radical evil. She said that evil did not come from a monstrous demonic nature, but from a total failure to think. She said Eichmann was simply following orders. He was banal. He was a bureaucratic processor. Arendt said Eichmann was not a fanatic, but a joiner who lacked the ability to imagine what his victims were experiencing, acting as a cog in the machine. She concluded that Nazi crimes were committed by and through the failure of individuals to exercise moral judgment. This is why I named my main character after her, because what I was seeing from 2000 to 2006 was exactly this, was people doing very evil things, i.e. the 9/11 attack, i.e. the Iraq invasion, and everyone just letting it happen. Not everyone. People were against it, but definitely not a majority. And during 9/11, that's when I really began to feel these Nazi undertones, the whole war on terror, the propaganda, the passage of the Patriot Act. I was like, is this Germany? Like, what is happening? And people just went along with it. I was not okay. I was 21 and I was not okay that they were passing legislation that removed my rights as an American citizen. I did not come from a political family. We didn't discuss these things. I was just a history major at uni who understood, you know, cycles repeat, people forget, things happen again. I hadn't started studying astrology at this point. I didn't understand why these cycles kept happening. Now I do. But back then, I was scared. I did not understand why everyone went along with it. I did not understand why people were oblivious and brainwashed. I knew that 9/11 was a lie the second it happened. I was warning people about what would come, but no one would listen to me. And this is how crazy it was. I voted against George Bush in the Republican primary in 2000. I was not a registered Republican or a Democrat. I wasn't political. I saw his face on TV when he announced that he was running, and my stomach dropped. My whole body froze. I knew looking at his face on TV, because I'm a psychic medium, that he was pure evil. I knew if he became president, something terrible was going to happen. I could not explain it. I really didn't tell people about it. I left university and drove to my hometown and voted against him in the Republican primary to try and stop him. I didn't know what else to do. But, that didn't work. He won the primary and went on to win the election. So, sitting here now in 2026, what's happening with these Epstein files, it comes as no surprise. Of course, this is what has been going on. Of course. I left the United States because I could see all of these things happening that made no sense to me. So many people disappearing. It made no sense. I didn't like it. It did not sit well. These networks, there are many more networks that are deeper and more powerful than you realize. These Epstein files aren't even the worst of the worst. There are other networks. This is just the one they're showing us right now. I will never forget the morning of September 11th. I woke up at 4:30 because I had to open a gym I worked in. I was there by 5 a.m. The gym wasn't far from Washington, D.C., so all the commuters used to come in. At around 9 a.m., I remember the TV across from my desk. There was a coffee cart run by a man named Muhammad. And on the TV, the towers were burning. So I walked over to see, why are the Trade Center towers on fire? My best friends lived in New York. I was worried. And as soon as they started to describe what was going on, the planes, I knew in my body it was all lies. I knew it. The question that kept flashing through my mind was, how could planes be hijacked in a country with the world's most advanced military technology? In my body, I knew it was lies. In my mind, in my logical mind, I knew it was lies. It didn't make any sense. And my advice to you is, whenever something happens, whether it be 9/11, whether it be COVID, stay calm. Don't get emotional. Don't freak out. Stay calm. So I went about my day because I knew that the best thing I could do was to not react, was to stay calm. I knew I was dealing with psychopaths and I was not going to feed into whatever game they were playing. So after my gym shift ended, I worked out. Even with the Pentagon being 40 minutes away from where I was, people closing down shops, people freaking out, panicking, crying, I just stayed calm. I left the gym. I drove to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. I listened to music in my Jeep the whole way. I tuned everything out. I went to one of the libraries at UVA where students were gathered, watching the TV, crying, very upset. And I went deep down into the earth to, I think, the fourth level basement where there were journals from the UK. They were from the 1960s, and they had interviews from psychologist William Moulton Marston, the creator of Wonder Woman. I was doing a research paper on him for my museum studies class. And so I spent hours down in the library basement on 9/11, ignoring everything. Now, eventually I had to come out. And once I did, I could see the TV was still on, students were still gathered, everyone was still upset. I drove home through the beautiful Virginia countryside listening to music. And once I got home, I walked into my apartment. My roommate was there. She was upset. The TV was on, the news was on. They were showing what was happening. And that was the last time I ever watched the news on television. September 11th, 2001. I have not watched the news since. I know it's all lies. Now, that weekend, I drove to Philadelphia to visit my boyfriend. People were driving on I-95 holding candles in their car, like a burning candle. They were pulling over on the side of the road on I-95 to hold candles in honor of the victims. I did not do that. I just kept driving. Not because I wasn't sad about what had happened. I couldn't be a part of it. I knew that with this event, they wanted my obedience, they wanted my sadness, they wanted my despair, they wanted my anger, and they wanted my rage, and I did not give it to them. And when the government blamed Saddam Hussein, I knew that was a lie. Being a psychic medium means you know things, but it can take a long time for things to unravel. And because of that, you can doubt yourself. It's hard to gauge how far down the time track you are. But my advice is no matter what, always listen to your intuition because you're probably right. So, to deal with all of this, because I couldn't talk to anyone about this was, 2001. I'm a psychic medium. No, no one wanted to hear that from a 21-year-old. Number two, 9/11 is all lies. No, no one wanted to hear that. So I was very much in my own world. So I started writing my novel and I called it New Henley. And this was 2006. I was still working for that huge corporate law firm. I just didn't know how else to explain to people what was happening. And in my novel, my characters live in a society run by a powerful businessman. The government has been completely replaced by businessmen. There isn't really a government, even though they pretend there is. And the government is called the board of directors. The man who runs the city state is called the chairman. And I gave them all German last names because I could feel these Nazi themes bubbling up and I didn't know how else to describe it. In my novel, there are two main characters, a man who is a doctor named Alistair and a servant named Anna. So the doctor, he's actually invented a device that can predict when someone will die. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was writing about AI. He had created a predictive device that used data. The female character, she works for a servant in a large home for visiting Chinese businessmen. So in my novel, I'd flipped it where China had become this more democratic society and the US had become this authoritarian, totalitarian society. And Anna, unfortunately, is trapped in this life that she didn't choose. The city state had been formed after riots and economic shocks destroyed the US. So Anna and Alistair, they live in New Henley. It's an old city with an old city center that has skyscrapers, but the skyscrapers no longer have office workers in them. At the time, I didn't understand it, but I kept seeing cities sort of empty at the core. And now I think we realize what AI is going to do. And so the people living in these skyscrapers were poor people who had been corralled into these city centers and trapped there by walls and guards. So these poor people had jobs during the day, but they slept on the floor of these former offices. New Henley was divided up into these like castes. There were the poor people who lived in the city center who were trapped there, sleeping in these skyscrapers. Then there were the servant workers. They were this, second tier class of citizen who worked in the surrounding neighborhoods in the city, these historic neighborhoods. They worked in these neighborhoods for the wealthy elite who were pretending like everything was business as normal. They were like actors portraying life as it had been before these riots. So they were acting as shopkeepers, bookstore owners, butchers, things like that. The wealthy elite would go shopping in these stores and experience normal city life, but the workers were all just slaves. One company owned everything. Everyone is bombarded and brainwashed by constant propaganda. And if you don't follow the rules, you disappear. In the novel, Alistair's father is a member of the board of directors. So he lives in this third tier outside the city on a vast estate. He works in a hospital for the wealthy elite, and he's supposed to inherit or step into the role after his father retires. And he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to become a politician. He doesn't remember the riots very well. He was young when they happened, but he feels uneasy about the propaganda. And he's really upset this device he's created is being used by the city state to determine who will live and who will die instead of to just save lives. So throughout the course of the novel, both characters have an awakening. But what's disturbing is that I'm watching my novel take place in real time. In the end, my novel really is about the heart and what happens when we disconnect from it. It's about empathy. It's about compassion. It's about what happens when we disconnect from our heart, from empathy, from compassion, when we disconnect from nature and we live in the ego. And at the time, I didn't really understand how that would be relevant in the future. But right now in 2026, it is the most important theme. We need to stay connected to our hearts. We need to stay empathetic. We need to stay compassionate. Our hearts are the source of creativity, of life, of love. We need to stay connected to nature. And in the book, the main character, Alistair, he is a heart surgeon. One of the story arcs that he goes through is that he finally figures out what the heart really is besides an organ. So what I want you to know, and this is really depressing, but I think things are starting to turn in the opposite direction. Don't think for a second the plan isn't to enslave you, to use technology to keep you trapped. Don't think for a second that the US government isn't being replaced by oligarchs, that it isn't being completely privatized. Your rights are disappearing. Don't think for a second that you can't do anything. You have to act now before it's too late. I have tried to warn you, and I still am. Let the systems fall, but fight for freedom, for fairness, for your rights, fight for love, fight for humanity. We need to start focusing on human rights and what that means in the face of all this technological advancement. So, if you'd like, you can read my book on Amazon.com. It's called New Henley. I'm really proud of it and it's a good read. So, please reach out if you need support. I'm at bigbeautifulsky.com. All the best.